Unlike almost everything else in my life, I started this podcast completely without a plan. I had a book that suddenly gave me access to conversations that I didn't used to have access to before. I knew that I loved these conversations and I wanted to do more of them, so it just became a podcast and it had the same name as my book. But as the podcast grew, I realized that this isn't just about like leadership principles or strategic frameworks. It's a lot about the people, the thinkers, and a place to think. So as this podcast moves forward, it will be known by the new name, Think Room, because that's what we've created, a space to think out loud and not necessarily have all of the answers to all of the complex questions, but rather to be able to think about them, the uncomfortableness of new ideas, and walk them through in a safe space. So welcome, and to kick this new series off, I wanted to introduce one of the thinkers that I truly listen to. His name is Alex M.H. Smith, and he has a huge following on LinkedIn, and he is really uniquely a strategist. Almost everyone within strategy is some form of strategist. I'm a marketing strategist or a product strategist, or in my case, strategy execution specialist. But he is a pure strategist, and we talk about how come companies in general don't even have a strategy. What is a strategy? And how come focus and prioritization are still the key things that will enable you to succeed with your strategy, and why most strategies in reality needs to be way more dictatorial than we're really comfortable with. This was a really fun conversation. I learned a lot. Welcome to Think Room. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me. Great to be here.
You are, to me, one of the true kind of outstanding and the unique voices on LinkedIn on strategy. And I remember us speaking just a couple of days ago that there's plenty of people on strategy, but you're one of the kind of pure strategists out there. How come you ended up there?
Pure ignorance is probably the real reason. Was to sort of go at it, to answer your question in reverse, I think one of the main reasons is that there are so few people who are pure strategy. In other words, business strategy, let's call it, as opposed to a subset like brand strategy or something, is because there's no market for this. Nobody buys it. And such market as there is only exists in very, very high corporate fields. So you'll have somebody like Roger Martin would be the obvious example of a pure play sort of high corporate strategist. And he can get away with that because he's dean of some business school and he's doing consulting projects for, General Electric and Ford. And so in that world, it is a thing. But that's a very, very rarefied world, and that can't support lots and lots of people. And so that's why I don't think that there are any other people who are stupid enough to do what I'm doing, which is, in a sense, what Roger Martin is doing, but for, kind of lower businesses. And so I ended up there because I was originally in a sort of marketing agency, ad agency. And this was a very small below the line agency. They did nothing approaching strategy at all. And I was just an account exec. But the good thing about a small business like that is obviously, there's the potential for you to forge your own path.
Yeah.
And somehow I cottoned on to this idea that in big, sexy agencies, there were people called strategists. Mm-hmm. And it was, and bearing in mind, I'd never met one of these people. I'd never worked with one of these people. I could only speculate about what they did. But, I guess in my head at the time, I thought, it's sort of what happens in between account handling and creative.
Just strategy has this kind of sexy sound to it, doesn't it?
And it does have a sexy sound to it, yeah. And so basically I said, I had sort of minor renown in this agency because I'd set up their research and evaluation department, basically just, evaluating the effectiveness of campaigns. And so this gave me a degree of internal credibility to say, hey, why don't you let me set up the strategy department? Even though I have no idea what it is, I'm just going to do what I think it should be. And we'll see how it goes. And as it happened, it went very well. It went very well because the agencies that this agency was competing with they also did no strategy. So this simply gave this agency a little bit of competitive leverage where it didn't otherwise have it. And provided that what I did wasn't completely stupid and destructive, it was always going to be a sort of a bit of a success. So in doing that, I obviously developed my own way of defining what sort of marketing strategy, comms strategy, campaign strategy is. And then as I was doing this, I started to notice basically that some clients that we had required a lot of strategy, by which I mean they required a lot of clever, creative thinking to make the crap that they were selling seem appealing.
Unique,
Whereas, unique and all the rest of it. Whereas some clients, the minority, they came along and you were like, damn, this thing is just really good. Like, we don't need do any song and dance number to sell this thing. We could just say, hey, look, hey, check this out, and people would want to buy it. And so I became very, very interested in what are the qualities that minority of businesses have, which essentially makes creative marketing be a sort of bonus for them, as opposed to being the thing they're actually relying on to push their product. And bear in mind, I had no idea that the whole sort of like business strategy, so to speak, was even a field, or that, you know, that there were books like Blue Ocean Strategy and there were people like Porter and all the rest of it. I didn't know. I never heard of any of this. All I thought was I was developing a completely unique new body of thought about about a sort of magical quality that certain businesses had, which meant that they didn't have to sort of puff themselves up with creative marketing. And I was especially interested in that subset of businesses like Tesla, Lush, Monster for a while, who had zero advertising policies. I was like, damn, if you have a business who can be cocky enough to have a zero advertising policy, you must be so amazing because you've got so much gravity coming towards you. So I developed all these theories about just by observing basically companies that I thought were doing this well and drawing the patterns between them. And then I went out on my own sort of as a consultant and tried to sort of sell this. And I was calling it strategy, but in my head, it was a kind of quite a unique body of theory. And I then did a TEDx talk, which got selected by TED as the video of the week or something, or the video of the day, however they do it. So it got quite a lot of views, all about my sort of theory, and got this nice feedback on it. But one bastard said in the comments, oh, this is basically just like the blue ocean concept versus the red ocean. And I was like, what are you even talking about? Like I said, I'd never even heard of like Blue Ocean Strategy. And then maybe like a year or two later, I thought, oh, I better read that book. And I read it and I put my head in my hands and I was just mortified. I was like, shit, like everyone's just going to think I basically ripped off this book. And then I quickly started to see that of course, it's not just Blue Ocean Strategy, but actually all, you know, Roger Martin's stuff, Michael Porter's stuff, all of this stuff is describing the same fundamental principles that I'd been observing, which are universal principles. Nobody invented the concept of the blue ocean or anything. It's just they invented the terminology. They didn't invent the dynamic. Everyone's just applying different terminology to the same fundamental concepts. And I was just the latest in a long line of people who had done that. So there was nothing a bit original in a sense about what I'd done at all. But then I realized that, okay, well, so I'm not this sort of like mega genius who's sort of invented a whole new body of theory. But because I came at it from such an intensely naive, clueless place, it basically created a whole new set of language to describe these things that hadn't been done before. I mean, blue ocean was a new form of language for it. And now I've got my own other forms of language for it. And when you put new language on something, it opens it up to a new group of people who were not vibing with the old one for whatever reason. And so sure enough, I saw that, well, look, I don't think there's the idea that you can run a business, found a business without having read something like Blue Ocean Strategy, to me is just nuts. I mean, it is insane that you would ever think to run a business without trying to grasp these most fundamental concepts.
And what's
But the
your
truth
experience
is that,
of the founders that, like, how many have actually done it? I mean, I've been in this field
oh,
for quite a long time as well, and I'm surprised at how few companies actually have a strategy as compared to just a random collection of tasks and actions.
people who've actually studied the field, as in like read a book like Blue Ocean Strategy, 0.1% or less. People who have got a strategy, not because they've studied it, but because, like me, maybe they sort of intuitively grasped what needed to be done, maybe 1%. Then maybe another 20% who think they have a strategy, but what they've created is not actually a strategy. It's just something else that they've applied the word strategy to. That's like another 20%. And then 70% are people who have it's never even crossed their mind to think that to develop something which they would even call a strategy. So those are the people who are in 100% reactive mode. That's my estimate. Does that align with your experience?
Yeah, sure it does. I think like my main experience has been with mid to large size companies, and all of them will have a document that's called a strategy. I do think
so. They might be in 20%, for example.
Yeah, but it depends also the definition of what is a strategy. Maybe that's a good starting point to kind of spark the conversation a little bit. Having worked with strategy for so long as you have, what's your current definition of how do you know that you have a strategy?
So the most accurate way of describing it is the way that you are going to give people something that they want, one, but that they can't get anywhere else but you, two. So it's a sort of a two-part equation, because to me everything comes back to the first principles of what is a business, what is any business on the planet, and I don't care if you're like Halliburton or a kid selling friendship bracelets. You're doing the same thing, and that is you're obviously trying to generate a form of value that people will be prepared to give you money for. So we can recognize, like just common sense, the more successful a business is at generating value, the more successful they'll be at collecting value. That is the entire game. So when we understand that, we then know, okay, well, step one is we have to give people something they want. And most people understand that you don't have to be very clever and strategic to understand, all right, well, we've got to give people something that they're prepared to give us money for. Where most people come unstuck is that they don't realize that in order for this to work, it has to both be something that people want, but it also needs to be something where the only form of supply is you. Because if I start a company selling socks and I could say everyone wants socks, therefore isn't this going to be a successful company? The answer is no, because I can get socks from a million different places. And then I'm going to be dragged down into the quagmire of battling the thousands of other sock brands to sell my socks. So if you work out this fundamental equation, which, like I say, in my book, I describe it just as the unique value equation, or another perhaps even more on point way of describing it is new value, because I have found that when you say unique value to people, they will bullshit you saying that what they do is what they offer is unique when it really isn't.
Yeah, I think there's a bias towards like really wanting your product, services, whatever, to be more unique than they perhaps are as well. So you're wearing like blinds on in a sense.
Precisely. So I have found recently that if you say new value, as in it's a form of value that until you came along did simply not exist in your category, that sets a slightly higher bar for people, I've found. That fundamentally is the game. That's the game of business. And you can run a reasonably successful business that doesn't do this. As we discussed before, 99% of businesses have no strategy. There are many ways to make a buck. There are many ways to skin the cat. You can just hustle in an unstrategic way and you can make it work. it's only a tiny minority of businesses that actually crack the unique value code because they've actually engaged with the fundamental strategic questions. And of course, those are the businesses which we all pay attention to and everyone talks about, and who make ridiculously outsized profits compared to their market average, blah, 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 blah. So I think that's another interesting side point to say that strategy is very much optional. It is not a requirement at all.
How much of this is a question of the core of the product or service that you sell versus more the marketing and the perception of the value of it? Can you have a fundamentally a socks company that is truly distinguished because socks aren't new?
Yes. So the next thing to consider, I think, which answers that question, is that if you're claiming to offer a new form of value in your category, axiomatically, you must be doing something new. This is another issue that I see where a lot of people will say that they're offering something new, but then when I say what unique feature, act, model, whatever are you using to generate that, they can't tell you. So you're very, very typically, when people say, oh, I don't know, let's say their business is all about great customer service, and I say, interesting, what innovation have you developed that delivers outsized customer service? And they can't tell you beyond, oh, we just do good customer service.
More.
So
yeah,
or we just care more. Exactly. So that's completely hollow. It's nonsense. So there has to be some hard, undeniable, unmissable, factual innovation somewhere within the business that unlocks that new value. Now, the thing is that innovation, when we say innovation, our mind, it immediately jumps to product features. And sure enough, a product feature would be the most obvious form of innovation to generate new value. But there are actually, obviously, a whole bunch. I mean, I simplify it down to 9 forms of innovation. You could say more, you could say less, but roughly speaking, I think 9 covers it. So for sake of argument, product features is one form of innovation, but another form of innovation might be like you're having a unique form of distribution or route to market. Or another form of innovation might be a unique bundling of 2 things that you could get before, but they've never been bundled, right? So, and also to your point about perception, branding can be a form of innovation if it is sufficiently aggressive and outrageous that it moves beyond just being nice presentation. So into something that you could call an innovation. So I would say that Liquid Death, being the obvious example, did something so unique with their branding that we can class that as not just branding, we can class that as innovation. So you can even just do it. It can be skin deep is what I'm saying, if you push it far enough. So this hypothetical sock company, I would generally say it's far more levers at its disposal to innovate and generate new value than what most founders think about. Because yes, a lot of people, even in the sock business, they will say, look, Alex, at the end of the day, we're just selling socks. I mean, a sock is a sock is a sock. And it's like, no, a sock is not a sock, is not a sock, is not a sock. I could list 10, not necessarily good innovations, but I could definitely list 10 innovations off the top of my head. So this is one thing that people sort of like need to kind of get over, this this artificially limited set of parameters that they can change within their category.
So in my world, there's always been like a distinction between like strategy formation, which is the body of work that you're involved in, and then strategy execution. And there's like between the different consulting houses, depending on depending on where they generate the most money, there's a debate like where is actually the most money being generated? Is it the more elegant the plan, or is it the ability to execute? Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, in some senses, this goes back to my horribly naive background, because even though now I've got a reasonably big reputation in the world of strategy, I remain incredibly green and inexperienced within the world of the sort of within the strategy industry. Like I fundamentally do not know if I don't know, we just take like McKinsey or something. I literally don't know what they do, as in like the shape of engagement and stuff like that. So I can only speak to my experience. In the past, because I was coming at this from a sort of the far theoretical strategy development end and with no executional experience. Obviously, that's the path that I've been walking. And obviously over time, from a starting point where I was like, man, you just give them the idea that unlocks it all. And then how hard can that bloody be? You just get on with it and just do it. I mean, I don't see what the complication is. Obviously, over time, I've learned the error of my ways. And you start to see, the richness and difficulty of executing even the most no-brainer strategy, perhaps even especially the most no-brainer strategy, is almost limitless. So in my own work, fundamentally, I don't really want to get deeply involved in execution, but I've had to have been dragged into that because in the early days of my consultancy, the success rate of me just sort of dumping a strategy on a client that the client accepts, they always like it. They always say yes. They're always like, thank you, Alex. This is what we wanted. It's never been a situation where someone said, we disagree with this strategy or something like that. That doesn't happen. Instead, what happens is they get very excited and they say, yes, thanks a lot, Alex. And I'm like, I've done my bit. I walk away and then check back with the company in a year's time and everything's exactly the same.
Yeah.
My estimate there is that probably only about 20-30% of clients had the wherewithal to execute the strategy. Which, and also from a case study point of view, as an aside for me, that was always still now, it's quite a big problem because when you want to point to a case study, you don't want to point to this fabulous strategy. You want to point to a business where you can look and you can see the strategy the second that you glance at it.
Yeah,
and you're
absolutely.
like, shit, that's very like binary and clear. And not many of my clients have hit that benchmark. So over time, I've obviously had to start to develop more and more theory and ways of doing things in my own naive sort of bottom up way to try and fix that problem and increase the percentage of companies who do an adequate job of executing. So I'd be interested in your experiences with execution because yes, again, this is something that I have somewhat been kind of making up from the ground up. And just as an aside, by the way, one interesting thing I've observed, which I'm sure will resonate with you, is that clients tend to think that they have executed when they haven't. So if you were to press these clients and say, hey, whatever happened with that strategy project with Alex, they're not going to say, oh, it was good, but we just didn't execute it. No, they'll say something, oh yeah, it's great. And we're doing it. And this is what we're operating to now. And happy days. And I'm sitting there like, what have you executed? What exactly is...
I think my experience, the core problem of execution typically comes from an inability to prioritize what truly matters. So the absolutely biggest problems is you spread your attention too broadly across too many priorities. And this, to me, really comes as a consequence of two things. One is it's even for these senior people, it's quite uncomfortable to say no to stuff. Like there's always going to be more opportunities than ability to execute. And especially like there's been this push for more inclusion in general, I feel, in leadership. Like there's push against the command and control style of leadership the last 30 years, right? And part of how that has influenced the strategic process or the rollout and anchoring of strategy across large organizations is that you want to build engagement by asking teams to kind of contribute themselves and how can you contribute into this strategic framework that we've developed. And what happens is especially for the companies that don't really have a clear idea of what is our strategy. It's more a collection of like somewhat connected bets that we do. Like the strategy might look like, okay, we need to launch our business into the UK, and we need to increase the leadership across the company, and we have this new product launch in the end of the year. You kind of call this collection of strategic initiatives, this is our strategy. And what ends up happening when you don't really have a clear picture of this with a big T in the beginning is our strategy, is that it becomes very, very difficult to prioritize. And when things are difficult to prioritize, managers on the lower levels, they already have difficulty to prioritize, because what they're involved with is their kind of operational whirlwind. And that's incredibly strong, because you have all of the kind of behavior change that goes into strategy. Like doing anything new, even if it's the right thing to do, is going to be difficult to get both into the teams and to the team leaders and to the team members. And you have the difficulty because it's quite unclear how this impacts my day-to-day business in a positive sense. And I do think part of the problem with strategy in general is the kind of delayed gratification in a sense. Typically, strategic efforts, the payoff horizon is quite long, and there's a risk element to it. And especially if you bring in very like practical stuff into it, maybe your bonus scheme is optimizing for a very short time horizon. It's like sales this quarter on the traditional service offering that we have, and building up this new capability, this new offering, whatever it might be. It might be a 2-year thing until it really bears fruit, and maybe the impact is really outsized then, but I'm incentivized now. So there's so many things that goes on making this quite problematic. And I do think, I don't know if this is a Nordic thing. I've been working mostly in the Nordics, but I do think that there are very few great strategy storytellers, if that makes sense. Because you have to build this vision of like this sock company in the future and how incredibly much better it's going to be later. But I don't find that many naturally gifted storytellers.
Let me stop you there, because that was just such a fabulous answer that like there's just so much I want to jump on there. I can see that you know what you're talking about. So like if I could just like address it in a coherent, ordered way, so it's one thing rather than 5 things. Obviously, I agree with everything that you put there. These are all the exact issues. Picking up on the first thing that you said, and this is one of my more controversial opinions, but it actually unlocks everything else. Like, I strongly believe that strategy is a dictatorial game. It's for an autocratic, frankly, kind of arsehole-ish leader. There is not another way of doing it. I mean, maybe in theory there is, but in practice it doesn't happen. Look at every single great strategic business leader in history. All of them were quote unquote problematic personalities. And people think that this is a coincidence, that Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, etc., leave a trail of enemies and bad press in their wake. This is not a coincidence. This is how it works. And go back to my point before, that you do not need to take the strategic path. There's nothing wrong with being a nice organization that is democratic and inclusive and all the rest of it. You can do that. Do it. But it's just not this game. Because then, linking this to your last point, this is a game of large risk, big value creation and vision. And that can only really be driven by the unreasonable perspectives of a dictator. And also, to the storytelling point, these dictators obviously are also going to be the best storytellers. Like all these, why do people still watch videos recorded in like 1982 of Steve Jobs talking on some internal conference? Obviously he was a great storyteller, and like and this all came from his unreasonable dictatorial vision, which couldn't be further from being inclusive or democratic. So obviously what you have now, most founders and chief executives just like most people, they're not naturally that person. But you have to, in my experience, you have to kind of arm them as much as possible to be a sort of soft version of that person. And they're never going to become, the next Steve Jobs, but that's just statistically, that's not going to happen anyway. But that you don't need that. You just need them to be a little bit more of a dictator than they already were. So yeah, I think that this is like people that they kind of have to embrace this, because this is a sort of a visionary's game with all of the positives and negatives that go with that word. And then just one little side point, which is a bit disconnected, but also just from something you said there, you talked about the delayed gratification. And this is also a problem that I have a lot. Like, I have my strategy program out at the moment with like trying to do this work sort of en masse with founders who have got less money, who can't afford a sort of like a direct consultancy thing. And so obviously you're trying to get testimonials and stuff like that, but I only dropped it like in November, and the payback, it takes quite a long time because they've got to execute everything and before you can say, a before and after number. But what I have found recently, and you can't always do this, but you can do it most of the time, is it's really good to create a semi-artificial situation where the business or the founder or whoever is able to get some positive blowback on the strategy before it's actually been properly executed. So a simple example of this would be like, if it's a business that does pitching, it's very easy to say to them, hey, you've got a pitch next Tuesday. Instead of, why don't you go in and say X rather than Y and just see if it lands better, even though we haven't really executed it and we can't sort of follow through on it. And that way you can then start kind of, that to me is a very effective way of kind of trapping the business into a sort of like a situation where they kind of have to execute. They sort of have no choice but to execute, because they've kind of, what's the word? They've sort of entrapped themselves in it.
Yeah, they committed in front of customers on a value proposition that they might not have yet.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's interesting. I think I agree. I think the value of... Do you think that strategy, a good strategy, is it always simple to formulate and communicate, do you think?
I do think that there are exceptions. So my explanation of strategy, I think, is true in 99.9% of cases. But I think that when a business reaches a certain size and a certain level of resources, new games become available to them, which are not strictly in the value generation point of view. So, like, if you are a company like, I don't know, Shell or something, like, there's a whole additional layer of complexity about how you can like generate shareholder value, which doesn't really have anything to do with kind of creating market value. Now, and this is, I think, also why a lot of the classic strategy texts are over bloated and complicated, because they're trying to write themselves to be relevant to the chief executive of Shell, let's say, who represents like a group of 150 people on the planet who have got that way of doing things. So to me, it's much easier to just essentially ignore the possibility of this kind of elite, hyper elite corporate strategy altogether, because then you do start to get in trouble. Definitionally, when you go outside of that, well, yes, I think that I find it hard to imagine any situation where you could have a good strategy that you couldn't essentially describe to a disinterested person in maximum 90 seconds or something like that. Because also part of it is there's obviously the content of the strategy itself is one metric, but then there's also the ability, which I think is extremely important, to describe the strategy to someone who doesn't care. That is a crucial measure of the quality of a strategy, that it can be at least somewhat academically interesting to like your mum or something like that. Because I do think that a huge part of strategy, maybe the bigger part of strategy, is not necessarily, is the idea a mechanically effective idea or not, because you never know that before the fact. And actually, I'm not even sure such a thing even exists before the fact, because I think the world makes space for new ideas if they're executed with flair and aggression. But I think that basically the idea, every strategic idea, it needs to have charisma, because a charisma will obviously make it easier to execute because people in your team will pay attention to it. It shows that it has a bit of mischief, which means that it basically has a bit of contrarianism, which means that actually mechanically it must be quite good because it in some sense undermines the status quo of the category. So like, it's also quite, I wouldn't say that there's no such thing as a boring but effective strategy. I do think that they exist, but I think that they are probably the minority. It's got to be something where you say it to someone and they sort of give a little chuckle and they're like, huh, yeah, I never thought of it that way before. That's cool. That's the response for a great strategy.
That's interesting. I never really saw it as clearly as you do when it comes to like, you don't have to play the strategy game in a sense. It's interesting to me because, like, is your opinion that you're kind of better off not playing that game at all in that sense? Because you have a tendency to build a lot of overhead with strategy as well. Like, it's a process that takes up time in a company and so forth.
No, I don't think that I would go so far as to say you're better off not doing it, because I do think that you could do a kind of like a 4 out of 10 job, which puts you better position than someone who did no strategy at all, but you aren't really doing what we might call a visionary or disruptive strategy. So probably like every business should be doing a 4 out of 10 strategy, which in practice is basically going to boil down to having a neat, mildly contrarian value proposition within their category. Anyone can do that without too much risk or thought, but most people don't. And also that can be done somewhat superficially. So like the internal changes that you need to do for that, they could be pretty low risk. So and all it really does is just make your business a slightly more sexy and vivid and coherent version of probably what it already was. But, I think did you read the book or come across the book, The Strategy Paradox by Michael Rayner?
Only as a title. Haven't read it.
Fabulous concept, a classic one of those books where like you read the introduction and and you get it, and the rest of the other 400 pages are just a repeat of it. But publishers ask for what they ask for, I guess. But it's an incredible insight, because he says the opposite of strategy is not failure. The opposite of strategy is mediocrity. Yeah. He says a good strategy makes you more likely to fail, not less. So that's the strategy. That's the strategy paradox. So I think it's really, really super insightful comment. And yeah, it could be logical to embrace mediocrity, and even going back to the those things about running a sort of a kind of nice organization. Like I'm sure there are organizations which are simultaneously strategic and nice, but broadly speaking, well, maybe what are you even in this game for? Like, are you in this game to maximize profits and to aggressively transform the industry that you're in? If the answer is yes, then you really don't have any other choice. But people are in business for other reasons, aren't they? So there are and other reasons are not necessarily well served by getting too deep into this, I suppose.
Yeah, it's not necessarily like thinking of it as good or bad. Again, you don't have to play this game. But I wonder about what you said in terms of, I agree with that strategy probably is way more dictatorial than we're comfortable with in kind of the modern management philosophy. But I wonder if you have to be, can you be a pleasant dictator, if that makes sense, a people-loving dictator, or do you have to be
I'm
an
sure
asshole as well?
No, I think that you can. I think the way that I would think about it is that a natural arsehole has a natural advantage, without even trying. But they don't have an advantage because they're an arsehole. They have an advantage because arseholes have got certain sub-qualities that are useful. Now, could those sub-qualities exist without the other bad stuff? For sure they could. Now, look, I don't know, like, I have no idea what these people are like, but, you know, there are people certainly there are highly strategic founders who have got, I'm not aware of them having bad reputations. The founder of Lush, the cosmetics brand, I think they're one of the great strategic brands. I mean, they're one of those companies that certainly goes on and on about all of the kind of virtue signaling, nice stuff under the sun. So I'd be quite surprised if internally they have this sort of hardcore SpaceX culture. I'm sure that they don't. So maybe that's an example. Another example, a similar one, is like obviously Yves Chouinard, or however you say his name, of Patagonia. Again, I don't know what he's like, but I've never heard anything bad. So no, I'm sure that you can have. I'm sure that you can have both, but I think that it's ultimately, I guess it's ultimately quite a rare quality.
Yeah, I think I agree. And I think you see the same thing across any domain, really, with the uniquely talented individuals. If you look at sports, for example, you probably have to be very, very egotistical to become the very, very top level. And as you said, the assholiness is probably it's more a consequence of you finding the behaviors that is rewarding in strategy, ability to prioritize, don't mind if you go your own way, for example. Those come way more naturally to you. I tend to agree with that.
Disagreeableness is a massively important factor in strategy, and it's just not a quality that many people have. And those who do have it, it obviously comes with it comes with baggage. So I mean, it's one of the things that when people are doing strategy development, one of the first places that you've got to look for unique opinions that the founder, unique perspectives that they have on their category. That's like step one. And the funny thing is that in my experience, almost nobody has got any opinions at all. People think they have opinions, but they truly do not. What most people call opinions are actually the status quo, but voiced forcefully. So, you know, someone will open a restaurant and you'll say, "Oh, what's your opinion on, I don't know, the restaurant business or something?" And they'll say, "Alex, let me tell you, I think that good quality ingredients really matters." And I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, this is not a disagreeable contrarian opinion. You're just forcefully saying what everyone would agree with. And once you move all of those false opinions aside, there's nothing left, because, you know, we naturally don't like to take a truly sort of lonesome path.
Tell me about the kind of journey of discovery that you take your clients on. So you take on a new client, say that it's a mid-sized company, a few hundred employees, maybe a few thousand. You're contracted by the management team in trying to nail down their strategy. What's the process like, and what are the kind of moments of clarity and the reasons behind those moments of clarity?
So my broad thesis is that the client brings the knowledge and I bring the patterns, in a sense. And my responsibility, I don't need to know anything really about their business, just the basic amount that I understand what they're talking about. And then all I have to do is really sort of pattern their knowledge. If a company wants to commission some form of research as part of the project, they can, and I think it can help. But I never make basically there's no research in almost all of my projects. I don't think it's necessary, because I don't think that it's not about discovering new information. It's about looking at the information you already have in a different way,
which is super interesting. By the way, it's completely the same thing when it comes to execution. Like, we are never domain experts, but we can for sure help with your ability to execute, because it's very generic across industries, even though all industries think that they're completely unique.
Yeah.
But I would have expected that it would be more important when it comes to the strategy formulation. Like, where do I fit into the market? But go ahead.
So, I mean, I have to get a basic amount of information, but I do rely on maybe foolishly, but I rely on a client understanding their own industry.
Yeah.
And in a generalized sense, and typically they do. And I don't believe, broadly speaking, that there is sort of hidden. There are exceptions, but broadly speaking, I don't believe that there is some magical hidden piece of information that we could dredge up that would change everything. Because also another factor to consider, which I believe in, is that most industries are very mature and they've got multiple players in them. And these players, like vampires, have sucked these industries dry of everything that you can uncover in a linear format. So you're not, and this is another one of my probably by far my least popular opinion that people don't like the most. I don't think that you can learn much from talking to customers at all. I think on a micro tactical level, you can learn a gigantic amount. And of course, because you refine things to make it as good for them as possible. But on a macro level, they're tapped out. They're tapped out, right? I think that this is a hangover from 20 years ago, when before the internet and everything else, when markets were less mature, you could, in theory, do a focus group with your customers and they drop some sort of bomb on you, which is just, there it is. That's the answer. Nobody in our industry has ever heard of this thing, has ever thought to do that before. And here they are crying out for it. So we'll give it to them and then we'll make millions. Like maybe that used to work, and occasionally, very occasionally it still works. But broadly speaking, those obvious answers are tapped out.
How much of that is a question of there's, I don't remember who said it, it's probably Steve Jobs, but like if you were to focus group and figure out the car by the point that there's no cars in the world, and ask your customers, what do you want? They want faster horses, right? But you wouldn't get to the car. Is that the argument, or is this a different argument?
Yeah. That was the Henry Ford. If I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. It's definitely a variant on that theme, which is interesting that he was saying that like 150 years ago, when actually there was no market was mature, basically. Yeah. So maybe he was a bit ahead of his time. But going back to the process, after I've done basic fact gathering, just so that I understand enough to talk about the thing, I used to have it more convoluted, and then in the end, I realized that I was sort of inventing work to give the perception of value to the customer that, frankly, just I didn't need to do. So I think it's best to just try and sprint at the solution as quickly and therefore as profitably as possible. So I like to do the first bit of work is retreat style, I call it, where just me and the founder. Sometimes they want to bring more people along. The fewer, the better. One-on-one, I would prefer. 1-on-2, okay. 1-on-3. After that, like I would try and push back on it.
What happens when you get the committee style? Is it just that it's not unique at the end of the retreat, or What's the main
It's
problem
not even,
there?
it's the, did you watch the TV show Succession?
Yeah.
So I think that Succession is by far the best sort of documentary case study of what real strategy looks like. Because when you look at how they do it, what happens is basically they have a chat and make a decision on their yacht at 1 a.m., which they then feed back to the bean counters in the boardroom to sort of rationalize the decision that they made in the casual environment. This is just how strategy works. Strategy is not something that can be done in office hours or in the perception of office hours. In my view, strategy is essentially a kind of a social casual act. So if it's just me and one person and we have got no agenda and we got no time limit and we're just shooting the shit, that is where you're most likely to dredge it up from. The more people that you add, the more formal and like a meeting it becomes. And also people are probably less candid as well, because I want the person to say very negative things about their business. I want the person to say very negative things about their colleagues, whatever, because we just need to look at all the angles and sort of like get as close to truth as we possibly can. So, I haven't had the sort of courage or wherewithal to do this yet, but I've often thought that where I want to take this to is that actual first bit of strategizing. Yeah, at the moment, I normally do it in like Soho House or somewhere like that. I love to do it in a public environment is another point. I don't believe in doing things in private, unless the founder's very sensitive in some sort of secretive respect. If you can do it with other people around, it also works better, because again, it's all just about the lubrication of the conversation. But yeah, I would actually like to do it quite literally Succession style, on a yacht or in some resort somewhere, or where like we're trying to get the person as far out from their office head as possible. And then we have what feels to them a completely meandering conversation. But obviously, because they're well versed in their business, I'm well versed in the patterns. So the whole time I'm just kind of patterning the stuff that they are saying, and the thing just naturally rolls until, I don't know, an hour and a half, 2 hours in, or most of the time by that point, you're already like, oh, like you said something there that if we were to look at it like this way or something, that I know has got let's say the qualities of good strategy. Even we obviously haven't sort of like tested it and kind of sort of what's the word, we haven't validated it, but we know that it has the right kind of shape to it. So you're trying to get to that sort of breakthrough in that completely social situation.
That means that you must have, from your point of view, some type of eureka moment where the founder suddenly says something where you're like, yeah, there we go, that's it. And what's that moment for you? Like, what is it that you typically find after the 2 hour mark?
I don't know if I could just sort of describe it as a sort of discrete thing. And normally they won't say it. Normally, I guess I will be the one who says it. They trigger it and I say it would be more the way that it comes.
But when you teach it to others in the kind of courses that you're designing now, what is it that you teach them to look for?
Okay. So the very basic pattern, which obviously when I'm doing it myself, I do it much more fluidly and broadly than this. Imagine. That's completely useless as advice. So if we were to kind of systematize it, the basic pattern that you're looking for is to generate genuine arbitrary difference from the norms of the category. Whether you've done that via opinions, whether you've done that by factual characteristics of the business as it is now, whether you've done that by sort of copying value offerings from other foreign categories, whatever. And then when you've got some arbitrary difference, exploring in what way could we imagine this being of value to the customer, or what type of customer would actually get something from this. So this is where it very much differs from the ordinary process, which is like find customer problem, answer customer problem. Very broadly here, we're actually starting with this. We're doing the solution in search of a problem process.
This has become quite technical. Do you think that you can give an example of the kind of before and after?
Yeah. So if we look at the textbook example would be something like the Nintendo Switch, where, okay, we look at the games console category. You've got two big players, PlayStation and Xbox. They are very similar in terms of what they offer, and they're each just trying to be better than the other one, and they're duking it out and who can have the more awesome, powerful gaming machine. Nintendo miles off. They can't compete on that standard category metric. So Nintendo are already different in that they're already quite weak. They're already underpowered. So this is an example of, let's say, a sort of inherent difference within the business. And so you're like, okay, well, at the moment, I can't see how that could possibly be a good thing, but it is different. And I also know that there's no way that PlayStation and Xbox are ever going to like voluntarily weaken their machines. So we're probably quite safe. But the question is, on what planet could this actually confer competitive advantage to us? Like, why would anyone ever want a low powered machine? Now, of course, it enabled them to make the machine smaller. Therefore, the machine could be portable. And this could then open up a whole new form of gaming. So obviously, not only is the Switch portable and the PlayStation and Xbox aren't, but it also lends itself to a different type of game, like party games, like Smash Brothers, stuff like that. So not only do they have that sort of functional benefit of like being portable, but there's a certain type of game which doesn't really exist much on PlayStation and Xbox, who are more like first-person shooters and RPGs and sort of serious games. These sort of like more kiddie or family-friendly party games that you play in the same room as someone rather than over the internet, like bring it to your friend's house and we'll play Overcooked or something like that. Like this is a whole new territory that Nintendo is able to own completely all by itself without any competitive pressure from PlayStation and Xbox. Also, plenty of people will buy a PlayStation and a Switch, but you would be a bit weird to buy a PlayStation and an Xbox, although some people do that too, but it would be a bit of a duplication. And this is why Nintendo Switch becomes the biggest console, the number one console in the world. But you see how like the point is that like what Nintendo Switch, the value that they provide to the market, nobody was asking for this before Nintendo gave it to them. So loosely speaking, I don't think that you could have researched your way to customer pain point solution, blah, 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 blah. I mean, I don't actually know how that strategy was developed inside of Nintendo. I want to stress. But the pattern of what happened out there in the real world is universal. So let's take it now to a very, very small business. So like 1-2 hour conversation that I had with one founder where the pattern was largely the same. And then that business rocketed its growth rate in the same way. His company is a property management company. So, they're the companies, if there is a big office building that is owned by a landlord, they manage the building. Yeah. So like maintenance, decoration, cleaning the toilets, whatever.
Which is interesting because it's a field that's very difficult to see that there are really unique value propositions in. Very mature as well.
Okay. Yes. Very, very mature, but also very, very stale, which is a good thing about it. So you think about like, okay, what are people really normally offering in that category? And um, and basically, obviously, the landlord just wants his building to be run well. He doesn't want to hear any problems. He wants it to be like, the lifts are working and the toilets are working, and I just want to have a well-run building. And so these are basically glorified maintenance companies, essentially, which is great. But in his case, I mean, what was the actual nugget that unlocked it? It was a year and a half ago. In the conversation, I can't remember exactly what the particular thing that they currently did that took us down a different tangent was, but for sake of argument, the thing that jumps into my mind, whether this was it or not, was that I think, they put their plaque on the outside of the wall, building managed by TSP. And they sort of want to be quite proud about that. And he was sort of talking about how, he wants people to kind of think, "Ooh, TSP building, that's pretty cool," kind of thing. And this then led to, well, if let's say these management companies are normally more in the background, and you're saying you want to be in the foreground. Now, what exactly would that mean? Well, this would mean that if people knew that this was a TSP managed building, maybe they would be more likely to want to put their offices in there than in another building. And then we talked about okay, so how would that be of value? What to the customer, to the landlord? And we're like, well, what is the main thing that the landlord's worried about? They are worried about occupancy, and they're worried about they want to have as long-term contracts and rentals as possible. So this is the main thing they're concerned about. And so we basically got onto, well, instead of thinking as a management company as primarily being a maintenance vehicle, could we think of it as primarily being a marketing vehicle? What if you were actually a management company whose entire offer was not built around, we'll keep the toilets clean, that's a given, but whose entire offer was actually built around keeping your building fuller for longer. So we will essentially be judged not by the operational qualities of the building, we'll be judged by occupancy, which is something that management companies just don't take responsibility for because it's not their job. But they actually can do, because obviously they actually have a huge amount of marketing power in the way that they choose to run the building and the way that they and all the rest of it. So then you can imagine, if you are a landlord and you're choosing a property management company, do you want the one who's just giving you that sort of functional offer, or do you want the one who says, however they end up doing it, your occupancy rates are going to be 30% higher if you hire us, and the length of your leases is going to be 30% longer because of blah 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 way we do things. So again, this is this is an example of how you sort of you begin with these unique qualities and then you extrapolate them to customer benefit. Now, of course, I mean, in that particular example, I suppose you could have interviewed landlords, and the landlords would tell you, what's your biggest worry? Oh, occupancy, right? So you could have come at it that way, but also you don't actually need, this goes back to all this shit is obvious. Almost always it's obvious, because I don't need to commission research to know that landlords care about occupancy.
Yeah.
So
but it's interesting because this is actually a type of, I don't know if this is a type of strategy, but one of the strategic plays that especially in the business to business sector, where you depend on generating sales to other businesses, a reasonable strategy is just to try to target your customer one level higher up than your competition. But what you have to do then is to completely switch your value proposition and talk into the kind of scorecard of that person. So a typical example would be most mature industries, the sales logic is very governed by the procurement logic, which always ends up in some type of cost scenario, and it's a race to the bottom of margins. Yeah. But if you can put your business in the context of the CEO, for example, and the CEO scorecard, how do my business actually impact your business's revenue, profit, or shareholder value? It's a much less crowded space. So I don't know if that's really a strategy, but it's for sure a play that I've seen as very effective in multiple companies.
It's very funny that you say that, because I have had a very similar thought that, like, there is a bit of a universal game in B2B, which I guess, is, as you say, you sort of would summarize it as moving from a we will do X service for you to we will earn money for you via the process of that service, is definitely something which I think every B2B business, other than the ones who are already doing this, of course, would definitely be well served to spend 2 minutes just considering how that would fit for them. And it is funny, you do get, you do start to see like the same basic strategy mapped over different industries. Like I wrote this piece a little while ago. I'm not sure how true it was, but I just did it for fun. But I do think it's at least partly true, where I talked about how actually there are strategic eras that all industries pass through, where there is a kind of macro strategy at any given moment, which broadly speaking works for that industry. So from what I remember, like the first effective form of strategy is supply-based strategy. So that's when the industry, there's just not enough of the thing being sold.
Yeah.
So if you read Shoe Dog by Phil Knight, everyone thinks of Nike as being this brand-led company, but it isn't. It's a supply-led company, because they came to prominence at a time when people couldn't get good sneakers, and they found a way to deliver good sneakers at scale. So that's basically how they became Nike. So that was supply-based. Then once the supply has been addressed, you move into an optimization territory, where it is, okay, fine, we can now get sneakers, so that's not a thing anymore. But look at all these like bells and whistles and features and like all these like little tweaks to sort of like make it sort of like the ultimate sneaker. So a lot of industries, I think in the 80s, so the 60s and 70s was supply, 80s moved into sort of optimization, 80s and 90s. And things become sort of more and more convoluted through the optimization strategy, because everyone's trying to make things look complicated and expensive and fancy, so that then gives way to the democratization era. And so like Apple is the arch example of the democratization strategy, because obviously like if you think about like early 90s computers, let's say, are very, very complicated and sophisticated and for quite sort of like hobbyist type people. And how do you then make everything just seem super simple and easy and friendly and accessible? So that's the natural, every strategic era is a response to the era that preceded it. It's a response to the pathologies of the era that preceded it. And all industries are going through this at different times and different speeds. For the most part, most industries, I think, now are in the democratization era, and most categories have got one big democratizing brand who's done extremely well in their space by basically being the Apple of their space, whatever that looks like. And the question then comes, which I had to be more speculative on, which is what happens after the democratization era, which I don't know, because I don't think that there are many industries in that space. But my punt, and I'd be interested if you've got another idea, but my punt is what I've called humanization, which doesn't mean what people, I think it means. In my case, what I'm saying is that like you have to look at the pathology of the previous era. The pathology of democratization is blanding. You know about blanding, and like, how all these businesses like Casper Mattress and WeWork, and they all sort of become the same, because these are all democratization plays. And they all become very sort of sterile, and every company looks the same. So then the antidote to that is to inject actual people into the businesses. So brands are a good example of this. So if you take like Logan Paul Prime, I think this is a response to democratizing strategies where I now want something, or Liquid Death would have been another example, actually. I now want something that isn't friendly and bland and safe and easy. I want something that is very particular and very, and the reason that we often will attach to a human is because obviously a human is one individual, so you can't get more particular than that. This is Logan Paul's drink rather than, a sort of universal drink. So that's my thesis.
It's interesting. When you're talking about it, I was thinking about, the kind of adoption bell curve, right? You have the early adopters and the early majority and stuff like that. I wonder if there's a mapping of your kind of framework here over towards that curve. So initially, like customers in the very early adoption stages, they're kind of fine with computers being at the hobbyist level and very complex and so forth. But if you're going to open up your market to a broader audience, they're not interested in that, right? And when we take that analogy or that analysis into what happens after the democratization, because you could argue perhaps that the democratization is when you enter the kind of late majority stage of a market.
Yes.
The question is, how much is left of a market after that? It's like, is there even a play for that market outside of either you say like this market is fully mature, there's the products are kind of what they are, all the offers and the analogy of the vampire that you talked about before, like it's completely sucked dry for innovation. We can't do that much more with like our things that are commoditized by this point. They are completely identical to each other. So the only play is to, it's interesting because we see so many industries going through this right now, right? Where you're trying, like, there's a reason why the idea of having a personal brand is becoming so widespread in terms of the value of it.
Exactly. And so, what do you do when the market has been sucked dry and it's become, and you have mass adoption? Well, basically, you have to just start effectively being weird in some way, in a manner that appeals to there's a certain subset of those markets who, for want of a better term, they kind of think they're better or more sophisticated than the normies who have entered their market.
Probably trying to do, like the strategic play in reality might be, you're trying to figure out a subset of this market is willing to pay a higher price for the same service, fundamentally. And we want to carve out only that subset of customers.
Yes, definitely. I think what sprung to mind is, so it's not an example of something with a personal, but Liquid Death is very much that, because I also think that is an era in some senses of irony, because people who buy Liquid Death, for example, you can't get a more mature market than like bottled water, canned water. People buy it almost in an ironic way for a joke. And it's a tacit way of saying, I'm so sophisticated as a consumer that I've moved beyond Evian and what the plebs drink. And I've now gone into this sort of meta commentary on this industry. And weirdly, another example of that, if we think about like smartphone thing, or the Apple thing, and smartphones obviously like being completely mature industry, and now you have the emergence of the dumb phone industry, which again is a meta play for people who think that they're too good, so to speak, for the category generic.
But it's interesting if you have to find kind of the meta trend that's probably not at all connected to the product and service that you offer. And offer that. So say the dumb phone. I had another conversation around, like, there's a broader trend with being constantly connected, right? And within the kind of elite stratosphere, you have enough time to reflect on that this is probably not a healthy behavior, having notifications on your phone always. So maybe 5 years ago, I don't know if this is something that would resonate with you, but I find it more and more that like I grew up with a father and a grandfather that was very like, you get your permission to vote as a consequence of you reading the news every day. So like reading the news every day was the kind of that you have to do that as a member of society. Reading the news nowadays, being constantly bombarded by notifications of some new catastrophe somewhere in the world, that's not necessarily the best way of contributing well to society, because you're just overwhelmed by stuff that you don't do anything about, right? So maybe the dumb phone is in reality a kind of a comment on that. I don't like there's no reasonable argument to be that up to date with stuff, right? So finding the meta trend for the niche market that you're trying to go for, the niche subset of the market, the most price insensitive part of the market, what's going on in their part or in other parts of their life that might impact like our business. It's very meta at this point, but it's interesting.
You could make, if you wanted to be a real strategy geek, I can already picture the model in my head, because what you're talking about is like the adoption curve strategy eras thesis is essentially kind of one half of the equation, which determines the shape of the strategy, but it doesn't determine the content of the strategy. So then the trend, the meta trend, that is what determines the content. So then you can basically mash together the meta trend and the strategy era equals the strategy.
It's fantastic. It's fantastic. This is a new business line for you. Just go to the most mature markets and run this.
That's not a bad idea. I mean, people have sold stupider things than that, haven't they?
Right, let's pivot for the kind of final section of this. How is AI influencing strategy formation, do you think?
I don't know how it is influencing it in terms of what other people are doing. I'm sure there's tons of stuff going on, but I haven't really kind of noticed anything remarkable. But in terms of where I see it going, so I mean, this is all just like personal opinions. So I think for me, and I also say this all, by the way, very much as not an AI expert, so I'm just saying what I've gathered. For me, the thing with AI is that it tricks you into thinking that it's something that it is not, because it speaks to you with sort of human patterns. You very naturally assume that it is, like a human brain. And that it's doing what a human brain does. Now, it's just common sense to say that an LLM and a human brain, structurally, mechanically, whatever speaking, have got nothing in common. I mean, nothing at all. The similarities are completely superficial when you look under the hood. So logically, they're doing different things. But unfortunately, it sort of appears at first glance that they're doing kind of similar things. So what you have to do then is you have to my way of thinking, you have to determine, right, well, what does the human brain do that the LLM doesn't? And what does the LLM do that the human brain doesn't? And when you then draw a line between these two things, then you can kind of create a partnership between them that's going to be effective. And in the case of strategy, I think that the two big things that, firstly, can an LLM or should it tell you what your strategy is going to be now or in the future? I think categorically not. Now, minor caveat, because most businesses don't have anything even remotely approaching a strategy at all, I will concede that just 5 minutes on ChatGPT is going to give you something better than what most businesses have, on the basis that most businesses have nothing. So I will concede that. Because it could just say something that's like very straightforward and inane, but damn it, at least they've got a little bit of like focus and clarity about what they're doing, which is worth something. But the thing that, like, AI is actually operating weird thing to say. It's operating with a real paucity of knowledge. It seems like it knows a lot. But you've got to bear in mind, it only knows recorded information. It does not, and there's much more unrecorded information in the world than there is recorded information. It knows very, very, very little about your business, because you can sort of break your business down into sort of bits of information that could hypothetically be recorded. It would fill all the great libraries of the world, because actually there's a lot going on, which most people won't bother to write down and feed it to an LLM. So a hell of a lot more than the LLM does about the situation with your business. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is that obviously they don't think, they don't reason, they don't have judgment. So when it says such and such is a good strategy, it doesn't bloody know. Only you can actually pass the judgment. And we've all experienced that sycophancy issue with the AIs, where like you can, because they're very articulate, it can sort of steel man any stupid thing that you say to it. You can think of any dumb opinion and say, give me an argument for why such and such is true, and it will do an amazing job of it. So how can you trust
That's another
that?
thing as well that I think is a little bit dangerous. It has a bias to agree with you as well. So it has a bias to convince you that your existing ideas are great.
Precisely. A huge issue. And then people say, oh, well, that's fine, because you can train it to do, you could say, oh, no, like challenge me. But that isn't any better, because then it just arbitrarily challenges you. The point is that it is not using judgment. It's just doing patterning. So like, but it looks like judgment. So to me, we have to think, okay, look, the human being has to do the judgment, and they also have to provide the information because they just know more. But the LLM is amazing at some things which most people are terrible at, which is, like I say, it's the knowing structurally what a good strategy looks like, and applying simple patterns. So one of the strategy precepts that I talk about a lot is the only is better than best precept. So it's a very weak strategy to try and outperform your competitors on the same terms. Instead, it's much better to be like doing something that only you do. Now, what I've found that human beings, most of them are incredibly bad at noticing the difference between an only strategy and a better strategy. Like, and you can tell them a million times and they just keep on making the same mistakes. They just don't like get it. But the AI never makes that mistake. They understand exactly, because these are word games, and this is what AIs are all about. It's about sort of seeing the patterns in words. So if you put in a insipid, our strategy is to provide excellence kind of crap, the AI can immediately say like, computer says no, does not compute. That is not a strategy. So where this all comes out in my mind is that like we think about, and then of course they could also understand the pattern of strategy development as well, stretched out over time. So I think that in other people, we have this idea that like the human being prompts the AI, the human being asks the AI questions, and then the AI answers those questions. But in the world of strategy, anyway, I think this is completely wrong. It should be exactly the reverse. The AI understands the patterns. The AI prompts the person, but it's the person who has to input the information, and also the person who, when the AI says, all right, well, based on that information, when we put it through the strategy meat grinder, here are 4 potential angles. The person has to use their superior knowledge and wisdom to say 3 of those angles, that they're all strategies because the AI's done it. They're all structurally perfect, but 3 of those strategies are just fucking stupid and no one's ever going to pay for that. But that one I can see what. And so to this end, I like, so in my program, I've obviously thought a lot about this. So I've built this exact thing that we're describing, and it's very early days. And so seeing how the people in my program, like how it can help them. And what I've seen is, it can arrive at a pretty solid hypothesis, which is very likely better than what they would have done by themselves in about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Which is insane. But so the speed is just like amazing when you've sort of like, when you train it to carry them through the process. But, it massively needs the human judgment. And so then what the way that I do it, they do that. They then bring it to me, and then we actually discuss it like with our judgment hats on, and we then sort of change or deny or whatever what created. And that judgment process, that could take, and it's not difficult. Like in principle, it can take just like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So what this amounts to is, I think, a pretty solid 30-minute strategy development process, which I don't think gets you to the ultimate answer in all worlds, because the AI is operating on a narrower set of parameters than you would do if you were doing a proper strategy project. But my God, compared to what people would otherwise have, it's crazy. It is crazy. So that's how I'm currently seeing it.
That's interesting. I like your approach to it. And I think the more that you end up actually working with AI, the more conscious you become of, like, these are actually the points where I, as the human, need to be. Because it's very easy to get drawn into the game of delegation with AI and completely delegate like the human faculties around yourself. And I think at least that happened to me. After a while, you get drawn back in. So my hope is that, because like obviously the maturity around AI is quite low right now. So most of the people are doing the same kind of, they're delegating as much as they can and taking themselves and the unique value that they bring out of the equation in the allure of being more productive and doing more things faster. But I do think that for most people, there will come a point, if you have any like unique value, where you feel like, wait a minute, this was too far and you need to go back in. And I think this is a really good example of it. I think in my part of strategy, which is more the execution phase, it's incredibly useful, because when you look into execution, the majority of the problems, say that you actually have prioritized and you've done the kind of strategic work that you need to do, especially when you try to scale it to then an organization, it can quite quickly become both more complex because it's more voices diluting it. But what ends up happening a lot of the time is that you lose a lot of the actionability. What does this actually mean? What do I do tomorrow that's different versus today? Their AI is fantastically good, because a lot of that isn't necessarily built around the idea that we do something that's unique for the first time. It's a lot of times is that we just want to implement whatever best practice around how we digitalize our warehouse that's already available. We don't need new shit. We just need the best practice. And there it's fantastic in terms of, we build obviously software for strategy, and like the strategic planning capabilities. If you give it a direction of, this is where we want to go, these are the bets that we want to make, just make us as good as the best in class. And the actual strategy part is rather that we combine these two elements that are new, but the elements themselves aren't new, right?
That is so true. And one thing that I would add to it is that it's also much more disciplined than people are.
Oh,
so
yeah,
like
for sure.
Once you tell it what the strategy is, damn it will stick to that strategy. And I can tell you that, like, the bloody founders and chief execs and whatever, they do not do that. So that is a huge advantage of it as well. So yeah, no, I could see that within execution. I haven't thought about that very much, but now that you mention it, yeah, no, it would be like, I mean, it's a game changer in both contexts, but I think it's a particular game changer in execution for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And it will be interesting to we talked about that briefly in the call we had a couple of days ago, but it'll be interesting to see the response of the bigger consultant houses out there.
Well, what I will say is that, like, wishful thinking maybe, but look, if I'd had my way, AI would have never come about. It's made my life easier, 100%. And it's just very, very annoying on a basic level to have to like adapt all the shit that you're doing to something which is being forced on you from the outside. It's like, obviously, I would just rather not have to do that. And I think where we are now, the equilibrium that's been reached is pretty decent, and I think quite kind of like manageable. Now, I don't know where it would then, and it hasn't been too destructive. The further that it evolves, the more destructive it becomes in unpredictable ways. And I'm hoping, like people think that these things evolve forever, but they don't. And I think it's weird how little people acknowledge that like all technologies hit a point of maturity where they effectively don't change. I don't know, like TVs have not changed for like 30 years to all intents and purposes. And smartphones, like the iPhone and the modern smartphone, there's really not much that you can say. It's just a polished version of the same thing. So like there will come a point when this technology will hit a wall. And yeah, candidly, I just really hope that we are close to that point, because there is a level of destruction that I think this could certainly wreak on any form of expertise-based business, which would not just be bad for people like you and me on a selfish basis, but I also think would be more broadly economically ruinous. Because at the moment, people still do respect expertise, unique points of view, da. But what happens if we get to the point where ChatGPT or whatever becomes the single source of truth, whereby why would I even bother ever departing ChatGPT as a platform in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you become a kind of like a snake eating its own tail situation. So it's not to say that the thing is better or worse than you or me. It's more to say that like people will never be aware that you or me even exist in the first place because they are locked into the platform.
But I think it depends on your kind of idea of how far forward will this technology actually develop. Because say that it stops somewhere around here, it gets good enough that the reality that you're talking about actually comes true. It's so good that you wouldn't need, at least in the short term, the expert. If everyone then has availability to those tools, everybody fundamentally served by the same dynamic. So there's no standing out in that market because everybody has the same tool. So then probably there's an argument for, if you want to stand out based on that, you need something else, right? Another tool, perhaps a human again. So maybe it's a question of, we'll go through a period of time where unique expertise won't be as valuable, but it'll be valuable again.
Yeah, hopefully. And I suspect that there will be, and I think a lot of this will annoy a lot of people, but I suspect that there will be a certain stubbornness from the human race about people, quote unquote, irrationally preferring human beings to do things when everyone will say, well, that's just so stupid because the AI could have done that and it could have done it much more cheaply and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And yet people just stubbornly cling on to working with other people, even when it is illogical.
Yeah, and you see that as well in like artisan stuff all around, right? Artisan bakeries and whatever. You can buy a really cheap loaf of bread anywhere, but you pay $10 or $20 for an artisan baked bread. A certain subset of the market, certain markets perhaps. I don't know if you want a artisan Airbus plane or if it's just some markets that are inherently like suitable for industrialization and kind of standardization.
And the one other factor I would contribute as well, which I can't really see AI being able to disrupt, but I could be wrong, is that people love brands. in all sorts of categories, people brands.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a single source of truth, by definition, you can't be multiple brands, right? So like there are different for sake of argument, there are different brands of strategy. Well, there aren't really, but like, let's just say there were. Then, it's, people want to buy from like X brand or Y brand, and they want to have the experience and the whole flavor and vibe of X, Y brand and Y brand. So like, there's a reason why there's thousands of different brands of handbag, even though, well, like a plastic bag would do the job of a handbag perfectly fine, which would be the kind of the AI logic. But people are always going to want to have that.
Is it tribe signaling almost?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I find it very hard to imagine how AI could really encroach on that part of human nature.
It would be interesting really to see how much, like you're very active on LinkedIn, and LinkedIn has changed a lot the last half year, right?
Yes.
It will be like most of the stuff, and I'm guilty of this as well, but most of the stuff is at some level AI generated, and it can be good and it can be bad AI generated, but there's a lot of bad and AI generated stuff that looks identical right now. I do think that there will be a pretty hefty penalty on those creators that are leaning just on AI for everything. Like there's no human element left here. And it's interesting, like I didn't think this would happen as fast as it has, because when AI first came along, we heard a lot of voices on like, yeah, but you can, especially for people that hadn't used AI themselves for writing, for example, there was this kind of elitist opinion on, yeah, but you can kind of smell AI generated text. And I do think you really can smell AI generated text, not necessarily for the same reason that I think those voices initially said, but right now you can really smell AI generated text.
Do you think so? I mean, I think it's a little bit better than people give it credit for, but broadly speaking, you're probably right. Unfortunately, the issue is more one of volume than quality, because like, quite simply, if there's just more stuff being generated on LinkedIn, let's say, everyone's reach is going to get less. And one of the main reason why AI has been bad for me, not to an extent where I've necessarily felt it, but I am cautious. It's one of the reasons why I'm now moving on to YouTube, is that one of my massive competitive advantages was that I can write incredibly quickly, and broadly speaking, very well. Most people can't do that. So I was able to create an incredible volume of content with very little effort. 2 years ago, that was a monstrous advantage, and now it just isn't. And that's really damn annoying.
Yeah. No, I agree. Like the quality of text isn't necessarily the problem. The problem is we were giving the opportunity to kind of mediocre thinkers to come across as thoughtful communicators in a sense. And we've been kind of filled, or at least LinkedIn, to my opinion, has been filled with stuff that is just repurposed thinking a lot. Like there's very little unique thought in a lot of it, more than it is a problem with the text in itself.
It's a really interesting point. Even before AI, if you think about good social media content, and that's good LinkedIn content, whatever. The truth is that there's a lot of value in people pumping out stuff about best practice if their audience doesn't know best practice. And a lot of the time that is the case, right? And that was already true. So you could argue that in a sense, it hasn't really, other than the volume, it hasn't changed that much, because people were already pumping out best practice material, which was harder to come by. Now with AI, they can pump out much more best practice material.
And it's also really easy to come by in AI. Just ask the AI, right?
Because and exactly. As soon as you get in the habit of asking AI for best practice advice, you are like, I really never read another carousel about, how to get 100 followers on LinkedIn or something ever again. And so the unique thought, it does remain valuable. I never really thought about it that way, but yeah, I suppose that it does, and it does just put more premium on you generating fresh concepts.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the generic lesson for like how to survive in the kind of AI era. Really reflect on what's uniquely your voice, and that goes into like how I work with AI as well. Especially like I've been guiding a lot of management teams through the very early stages of AI adoption, because the one of the kind of initial feelings, especially from like senior managers that are typically a little bit older as well, is that they behave around AI as they would on Google. They ask a pretty, like when you start Googling stuff, you do it because you don't know, right? So you ask a question, and then by browsing the results, you're kind of slowly navigating towards where you want to go. That approach in AI doesn't work that well. I find like you really need to think a lot before you ask, in a sense. That's how you get value back from AI. Spend a lot of time in really zooming in on what's the core part of what I'm trying to do here. And I find it incredibly positive for my thinking, because it forces me to think longer and harder at the problem before I attack it, in a sense. And I think that's a very positive thing, but I don't think necessarily that's the average experience of how you use AI.
You have to use it with a degree of discipline and discernment that most people just aren't going to bother with. And going back to the point about how it gives you the impression that it's doing things that it is not actually doing. And so you have to manually override. You have to basically constantly be thinking, on a technical level, how has the LLM created the response that it has given me? And based on my loose understanding of that, how much do I trust the response? You might have seen those viral clips going around where people like give it a picture and they then ask it 100 times in a row to exactly replicate the picture, and then they show you like how weird the picture evolves, which I think is really interesting, because I think that really sort of shows you kind of under the skirt, so to speak, of how it works, because it obviously isn't replicating the picture. It's doing some form of statistical pattern recognition where it's sort of saying, statistically, what do I think this picture might be? So it is doing something which, compared to like a human understanding of the question, is intensely stupid. And we can see that particular hack, how stupid it is. But it doesn't occur to us that it's always doing this. And sometimes that process is going to yield a fantastic answer, and sometimes it's going to yield an untrustworthy answer. But how can any of us be expected to operate under this level of sort of judicious, thoughtful kind of filtering of what we're seeing? We're not going to. We're just going to say, tell me this, and cheers, I got it. You know what I mean? So it's
absolutely. But it's interesting.
Moral hazard built into it.
It's interesting. Like, how would we know? Like, this is new to all of us. So I do think it's a fair assumption to say that we're learning the limitations as we use it, in a sense. And I grew up in a school where like internet was pretty new. So how you evaluate sources was something that we really had to train on, right? And I do think it's going to follow a similar path. Like, so this is a new thing. You have to watch out for hallucinations or whatever it might be. And how do you deal with that from like your like how do you structure your thoughts around that problem in order to get the benefits without the problems around it? And probably we'll find similar things, and the model will control better and better for certain things. But here and now, I think the recommendation, as we've come back to multiple times during this conversation, is you have to be conscious about what's kind of your value contribution, and care enough in a sense. I think that I hear that between the lines of what you speak as well about strategy. Like, you have to care enough if you want to play this game at all and be successful. You fundamentally have to care about the game.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And I guess like there is so much. I mean, I love all this content as much as the next guy, but there is sort of ever since maybe Tim Ferriss and the 4-hour work week, there has been this incredibly mechanical understanding of business where there is this sort of theory that if you build the kind of the perfect machine with the right click funnels and CTA here, not there, and blah, 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 you're going to create this sort of automated money printing machine. And AI has taken that to a new level, because I don't think anyone's actually done this successfully yet, but people act like they have, where you basically, you see the odd tweet where someone says, I've built a 10 million revenue business where the AI did the entire thing all completely by itself and I did nothing. Yeah. And it's sort of like, it's all sort of bollocks, but it contributes to that idea that like, if I could just stack enough kind of like tactics on top of each other,
hacks,
then this thing is going to work.
Yeah.
And as long as people, and it's very hard to resist, because it's a real siren song to think, if I design my funnel in the right way, I'm going to earn millions. And obviously there is also a lot of best practice value in all of that stuff. But yeah, it fundamentally doesn't work, because you do actually need, for any successful business, there is a bit of magic somewhere in there, which the grit that makes the pearl.
Yeah. Fantastic. Hey, Alex, this has been a fantastic talk. Thank you so much for your time. Where can people find you if they don't follow you? I think you're a fantastic voice on strategy, so I would highly recommend a follow.
Well, on LinkedIn, you can find me as Alex M.H. Smith. The M.H. is very important, because obviously Alex Smith is an ungoogleable name. It's not just because I'm pretentious. And also then, the best stuff is on the newsletter, The Hidden Path. And if you just go to basicarts.org/newsletter, then you can sign up there. And obviously check out the YouTube channel, which is Alex M.H. Smith as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Think Room Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like this episode, please share it to somebody in your network that you think would find it valuable too. And if you loved it, I would love for you to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening to it. If you want to join our newsletter, head to thinkroompodcast.com and sign up. And thank you so much.